All right, previously we had talked about Christianity in the British Isles, and he was just talking about that with us here. Really, the British Isles and to Ireland become the place where Christianity is preserved. It comes here and it's preserved later on when there's a lot of trouble in the West. There's a lot of military upheaval, a lot of invasions that we're going to talk about here. And of course, up here in the islands, a lot of this is preserved. So, we did already talk about Patrick, so we're going to move on now to another monk who becomes a missionary. So monks and missionary, or missions with monks, or monks that carry out missions, is very common. Columba, you see pictured here, works in Scotland, which I assume you know Scotland is on the same island as England, right? It's the northern part of that island of England. And he actually forms a monastery on an island. If you're picking up on this, monasteries are often quite remote. What we haven't talked about in here, and I don't know if we're going to have time to talk about it in here fully, in detailed account, would be the beginnings of monasticism. Monasticism begins actually in the east. It begins in the deserts of Egypt. And basically it was people who would withdraw from society. They would withdraw to be alone, to think about spiritual things. You know, in your life, of course, your life is filled with things. And you like to fill it with things, you know, like your phone, your Instagram, your Facebook, your video games, whatever else, your Netflix. And so you fill your life with what we call screen time now. So while you're sort of alone, you're not really alone, right? I think it's interesting. We'll get a whole group of people in a room, right? And everybody is doing their own thing. But what a lot of them are doing is actually sort of connecting online with people while they're sitting around in a room with people that they choose not to connect with. They ignore, right? Because it's too fascinating to look at the screen than it is to, pay attention to the people in the room. Yeah, okay. That's what our life is. So for us then, being solitary is basically no one is solitary anymore. Even when you're alone, you're not solitary because you're always interacting with who knows how many other people, right? So I assume what the monks would do today, of course, is definitely not allow smartphones, computers, Wi-Fi, and the internet so that you can actually connect with God. And so a lot of them would go out into the wilderness. This is how it got started in Egypt. They were the desert monks, or the desert fathers. Then some of them divided themselves vertically, right? They would be on pillars. Up in Syria, you had the Stylites, or the stylite, which is a pillar. And Simeon, the Stylites, he was way up high on a pillar, and he would just live up there by himself, so he was separated vertically, so people couldn't actually get to him, although they could kind of see him. But this is what happens when the monks go and separate themselves, then to become an object of interest to people. And they say, I want to go see, it's like an attraction, I want to go see the desert fathers, I want to go see Simon Stylites and so forth. Let's go see that. Let's go see him. Or I read about him, or what I hear about him, I want to go meet him. And so these guys want to be alone, everybody wants to come meet them. And then pretty soon, they want to move in next door, right? These guys living in a little cave. Well, they carve out their own little cave not too far away. And they say, hey, can we talk every day? Can we meet? And he's like, look, I'm out here to be alone. So anyway, they do start to then share a few meals together. But then this idea of being alone together sort of catches on, and we have what's called Cenobitic monasticism, where your life is together. And so this is where monasteries actually begin. A building that's set up with little rooms where each sort of imitating the caves that they had out in the desert. You'll each have your own little room. They even call it a cell. That's where we get the idea of cell in a jail. You have a little cell, and that's where you live. A little bed in there, maybe a little mat to lay on. You could be there to be isolated. And then you would come out and do certain things together, certain prayer times, meals, things like that. You would do together. So this is how the monastery got started in Egypt. Part of the problem was when it moves to the west. Jerome brings it there, and then you mentioned Benedict. Benedict organizes it. Jerome brings the idea. He's a Western saint. We call him Saint Jerome. He goes and lives in Jerusalem and stuff. He interacts with the monks that are there. And he brings the idea of monasticism back to the West, back to Rome. Especially, it also includes the idea of celibacy. And there are a lot of the local ladies of the church who come and study with Benedict or with Jerome while probably their husbands are at work, right? And they start getting the idea that to be a better Christian, they should be celibate. That doesn't go over too well with some of them. And then Jerome kind of gets the idea of monks, celibacy, and monasticism going in the West. Part of the problem was sometimes the monastery would attract people who were, can I say the word lazy? Is that politically incorrect? I probably can't say the word lazy. They are work challenged, or whatever you want to call it.
Work free.
What's that?
Work free.
They want to be work free. Yeah, that's it. They want to be work free. And it sounds like the monastery is the place to be, right? They give you food. They give you a little place to live. You don't have to pay any rent. Don't have any work. Just kind of lay around. Say you're meditating in your room, right? And you go out for the meals, and it's all pretty good. So Benedict decides that this is not a healthy thing. This is not a spiritual thing. And so he actually sets up the rules. You were talking about the rules. And so his rules, especially in the West, the rules of St. Benedict will become the basis of the rules of the monasteries. They will have some modifications and later things, but really his rule becomes sort of the basic thing. And what is that? It has a kind of schedule. When they're supposed to get up, when they're supposed to have times of prayer. And at various times, like get up very early and go and pray. Very early, like 4 in the morning or something. So, it's kind of wake up the lazy guy, right? Have him go out and do the prayer, come back. Then, they would have a morning meal, and then they'd have other prayer times. So they'd have about 4 or 5 of these in a day until you go all the way till evening. Vespers, it's called. Vespers is the final prayer time. So you're doing like about 5 times, 6 times a day, you're having prayers. And then you have some meals in there. Well, what about the rest of the time? Jerome says, basically, the monks need to work. And so they do various work. One of the things the monastery, since it's remote, is to be self-sufficient. How's it going to be self-sufficient? It's going to have to raise its own food. It's going to have to grow crops, maybe have some animals. They don't eat a lot of meat in the monastery, but eggs, things, chickens maybe, stuff like that. So they will have some animals. They will have agriculture, growing wheat or whatever. Usually they have some kind of product they produce that they sell that brings in actual cash money, or they can trade it for other things they don't have. Okay, so if they're making, let's say they're making wine or olive oil or something like that, they would then sort of put that in packages, right? And then they would trade it to the local people for other things they don't have, which might be cloth or something like that. Or they could sell it and actually get the money to buy things. So in other words, he starts, the rule of Benedict starts to say that there's going to be a rigid, you're not just going to lay around the monastery, eat food, and just hang out. You're going to have things to do. You're going to be praying. probably about 6 times a day. You're going to have the meals together. You will have work that you will do. Some of that work is, and sometimes it changes. You do a certain kind of work in the morning, another kind of work maybe in the afternoon, or it gets rotated around. So some of that work is physical work of crops, taking care of animals, cleaning the monastery, stuff like that, laundry, things like that, but cooking, but also what we might call scholarly work, or at least the idea of copying manuscripts. So you would learn how to read and write, and then they would have a scriptorium, it was called. A scriptorium was a room, not really that unlike this room, I guess, where it has it's kind of a podium up front, and it has places for people to sit and write. And then what would happen is you would read, like say I have the manuscript, I would read the manuscript, I'd read a line, and you would write a line, I would reread the line, you would check the line, and then we'd move to the next line. So what do we got in here today? We got 7 people, and me, I'm 8. So out of these 8 people, we could then produce 7 copies of that manuscript. So if I have a manuscript, we could produce numerous copies of it, whoever's in there, and we would just go through it line by line by line, copying it, physically copying it, but we're making our multiplicity of copies by the number of people who are doing it. So that's a work. I mean, that's brain work, right? It's kind of tedious because you got to go over and over and just do that all day. Then when you get done, now you've got 8 manuscripts, or 7 or whatever, 10, however many you got. Then you take that manuscript of a book you already have, and you go and trade it. You trade your copies for copies that they've made of theirs. So you go down the road, you go a few miles away. Here's another monastery. They have a book we don't have. They've made copies of it. Well, so I tell you what, I'll trade you a copy of the book we have for the book that you have. Well, that sounds good. And hey, by the way, we got like 2 copies of this one because when we went to the other monastery over here, we decided, hey, we'll get 3 or 4. Maybe we can trade those. You want one of those too? Do you have any other books? And so then they begin to trade. And this is how manuscripts, like he was just saying, manuscripts of ancient Roman authors, as well as new works, were written by these monks. As he mentioned, the Venerable Bede. All right, so this is how this happens. And in a place like Ionia is a monastery where this would happen. Another thing that they would copy would also be the Bible. They would make copies of the Gospels or things like that. Sometimes they would illustrate them with very elaborate, beautiful illustrations. Sometimes they make a big letter that's painted, right? First letter. Other times they fill it with images of what's going on or images of their life. Well, when the Anglo-Saxons invade, they will invade England and pretty much wipe out Christianity there. And so it will be these monks coming back in that reestablish Christianity in England. Many of them coming from Ireland. This is why Patrick, as we just mentioned, why Patrick flees and so forth. And they go to these islands and these monasteries, and then from there we see them altering what they're doing.